So my presentation is on Sick Room by Billy Collins, which was written in 2003. In this first slide, I overlaid two images, one of a hospital room and one of a painting of Venice, to try to encapsulate the vibe of this poem, which I will read. Sick Room. Every time Calanetto painted Venice, he painted her from a different angle, sometimes from points of view he must have imagined, for there is no place in the city he could have stood to observe such scenes. How ingenious of him to visualize a dome or canal from any point in space. How passionate he was to delineate Venice from perspectives that required him to mount the air and levitate there with his floating brush. But I've been sick in this bed for over 60 hours, and I'm not Calanetto, and this airless little room with its broken ceiling fan and its monstrous wallpaper is not Venice. So I'm going to start off by looking at the structure of this poem. So there's 9 couplets with 18 lines. When I first read this poem in my head, I didn't notice any rhymes. There's not any end rhymes that I noticed, but when I read the poem out loud, I kind of noticed that in the 5th and 6th stanza, delinate and levitate kind of rhyme a little bit, and so it made me search for some other internal slant rhymes, and I could be reaching, but in the 1st and 2nd stanza, every time and sometimes, in the 3rd and 4th, there is with ingenious. Yeah, no, it's probably reaching a little bit, but I did notice those instances of rhyme. If not for those, I didn't notice any other points that there was rhyming in this poem. But the thing that stood out to me most about the structure of this poem is that there was a turn in between the 6th and 7th couplet. There is an intense shift in tone and also setting, which reminds me a lot of a sonnet, but this isn't a sonnet because there's only 18 lines. So I'm going to break up this poem into 2 sections, before the turn and after the turn. So I'm going to look at the first 6 couplets first, which I'll read again. Every time Calanetto painted Venice, he painted her from a different angle, sometimes from points of view he must have imagined, for there is no place in the city he could have stood to observe such scenes. How ingenious of him to visualize a dome or canal from any point in space. How passionate he was to delineate Venice from perspectives that required him to mount the air and levitate there with his floating brush. So in this section, Collins makes allusions to Giovanni Antonio Canal, who was professionally known as Canaletto. He was born in Venice in 1697 and died in Venice in 1768, and he's most famous for his cityscapes of Venice, London, and Rome. He's also famous for the certain kind of painting called caprese paintings, which are of fictional cityscapes. But sometimes these kinds of paintings utilize real architecture, like 2 buildings that are real buildings that exist in the real world, but putting them next to each other when they don't actually exist next to each other. And so sometimes the fact that these paintings were fictional but utilized existing architecture kind of blurred the line between I don't know, it made it very unclear which paintings were of real cityscapes and which were kind of fictionalized. And I think Billy Collins kind of talks about that in this first section of the poem when he really gets into his imagination, Calanetto's imagination and his ability to paint Venice from angles that he couldn't otherwise actually exist in to look at. So for example, these 2 paintings by Canaletto, particularly the one on the top, if he were to set up his painting supplies and stand there and paint the scene, he would have to be, like Colin said, like levitating in the air to do this. But I think this first section of the poem really just focuses on like praising Canaletto for like his ability to imagine Venice from angles that he would just have to imagine, because he literally can't reach those angles. He can't levitate in the air, but he is capable of imagining Venice from all these different angles, which is just reflective of his like love and dedication for Venice, which I think is what's getting praised the most. I also noticed that in the second line, Collins personifies the city of Venice by using the pronoun her, so personifying her or Venice as a woman. And it made me think about like the whole relationship between artist and muse, and how Canaletto is a painter, he's an artist, but his muse is the city of Venice. And so Collins personifies the city of Venice as this like female muse, which is interesting. There's also not a lot of imagery in this first section of the poem. Venice isn't really described. In the fourth couplet, Collins mentions the dome or the canal, but doesn't really go into any more in-depth description of Venice besides that. The main focus really stays on Canaletto as an artist. The most like striking image in this section of the poem is like the image of Canaletto like floating in the air to paint these paintings. But besides that, there's not much imagery happening. So after the sixth couplet, there is a turn. There is a shift in tone and in setting. So the title of the poem, Sick Room, kind of puts the reader into the setting of the sick room, to which they are immediately taken out of that setting and placed in Venice. And then at the seventh couplet, they are pulled back into reality, into the original setting, which is the sick room. There's a shift in tone because it goes from very like complimentary to very bitter. And it also goes from being very like imaginative to, well, the setting goes from being like within one's imagination to being pulled back into reality. So I'm going to read this section of the poem again. But I've been sick in this bed for over 60 hours, and I'm not Canaletto, and this airless little room with its broken ceiling fan and its monstrous wallpaper is not Venice. So the imagery in these final couplets provide like a contrast, a bleak contrast to where we just were, which was Venice. There's a lot more imagery, in my opinion, in this part of the poem when describing the sick room, like calling it airless, talking about the broken ceiling fan, calling the wallpaper monstrous. We go from visualizing, even though he doesn't use like a lot of imagery to describe Venice, I feel like readers automatically visualize the very beautiful scene that is Venice. And especially since the first part of this poem is talking about art, we like romanticize it a little bit. And so we're kind of pulled out of that romanticization, I can't say that word, and kind of brought back into this bleak reality that the speaker is in. So this poem never really talks about the body as affected by illness or death as caused by illness in any way. It mainly just focuses on like location and the room that the speaker is confined to, and therefore the places the speaker can't be because they're confined to this room. So I think this poem really focuses on like sickness as captivity in a way, or like sickness as inability. Because the first part of this poem focuses so much on an artist, and the things that this artist was able to create using his imagination, it kind of contrasts to where the speaker is also as an artist, but they're confined to this sick room in which they can't make art, and their only escape really is through their imagination. But unlike this other artist, Canaletto, who's able to use their imagination to create art, the speaker is really only using their imagination to escape their circumstance in a way. And it also shows the way illness robs people of experience or ability to make art or travel. This poem also reminded me a lot of Lamentation Without Opportunism and The Undying by Anne Boyer. Just like the exercise of thinking about other people's circumstance and like what they would rather be doing if they weren't stuck in that circumstance. And I think this poem is really about kind of like being bitter and sad that the speaker is stuck in the sick room due to their illness, and they're unable to do literally anything else, which is make art or leave the room at all. So that's all, and thank you for listening.